And we want to welcome you to our Wise Wisconsin Wednesdays. Today we have an amazing presentation called Bigger Than a Bread Box. Cross note, the biggest bread box ever. So we're looking at civic engagement today, and we have Dr. Elizabeth McCrank. She is the Community Leadership Development Specialist at UW-Madison Division of Extension. And when I asked her what she wants me to say, she pretty much said, I work with organizations to develop leadership so they can get more done. And frankly, I could always use more help to get more done. And so I'd like to turn it over to Elizabeth, and just a couple Zoom tidbits. If you would like to go down, there's a chat box. You can put any questions in that chat and we will get to those during breaks in the conversation. We will also, if you would like to go up to the right-hand corner and hit view, you can change your view to gallery view or some different things like that. And then on the bottom left, there's the stop and start video, as well as the mute button. And if you want to just keep yourself muted until you need to answer a question, or if you want something to say, we ask for that. So Elizabeth, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Heather. Hey, thanks, everyone. Good morning. I hope everybody's someplace nice and safe and warm. The snow has not started up here in Merrill, Wisconsin, which is in Lincoln County, very heavily yet. We're going to get it this afternoon, but I think some of you might actually be experiencing it right now. So welcome, and let me begin by giving you a little bit of background about myself, more than what I had Heather give you, because sometimes I find that it helps people. If you know a little bit about the background of the person, it helps you understand how they came to the perspectives that they come to, because one of the central principles whenever you're dealing with human beings is that there's a whole bunch of different points of view. People see things all sorts of different ways, and almost all of us filter things based on our background and our past experiences. So my background is in history and cultural anthropology. And it's important for you to know that, because the anthropology side of me tends to look at the biggest pictures possible in any given culture. We look at everything that human beings do. And the old exercise in ethnography was drawing a map of all the cultural aspects of any particular set of human beings, whether it was a village or a state or a larger social gathering. And so I have that kind of outlook where I tend to look at big issues and big interactions and big movements. But my hardcore training is as a historian, and I tend to look at culture as a product of the ways that people did things previously, and then how they use that to shape what they're doing presently. So there's a little bit of anthropology in the things I talk about and in the way I look at the world, and there's a little bit of history, and all of that comes together in some very odd constructions that I'm hoping to share with you today. So, and hopefully not too odd, but you will find that there's a lot of vintage references and some oddball trivia that pops up, and the history and the anthropology tends to interweave with each other and circle together. So when I was putting this talk together, I just had ideas coming from all over the place, and after a while, I was just frantic. I thought, oh my gosh, there is so much I need to tell people, so much I want people to think about. I want them to do this and this and this and this. And it seemed a little overwhelming. And then I kind of laughed, because I thought that is actually the point that I'm trying to make with people today, is that there is so much more than about civic engagement than people usually realize. And the purpose of today's conversation, what I'm hoping that you can take away from this, is that civic engagement is so much bigger than people have ever imagined. It's actually bigger than the biggest bread box you can ever imagine. And it's a weird little title that came to me and stuck with me. And once I came upon it, I couldn't get away from it. So let me step away from the bread box for just a moment and tell you what I want to do today is I want you to think about what civic engagement is, as well as what it is not. I want you to know why it's so important for us to do it, why we make an effort to do it. And then I want to make some suggestions about the process that you can use to enhance civic engagement, even if it feels like you are Sisyphus and it's an uphill battle and you are pushing the rock up and it just keeps falling back down on you. So I'm hoping that you come away from this conversation with those three things, and maybe some odd little tidbits along the way. And I will tell you that my PowerPoints, sometimes I love PowerPoint, but sometimes I get excited with it and it feels a little bit like I'm having a thumb wrestling match all by myself, because I used to get excited about animations and things, and then I stepped back from that. Almost all of my PowerPoint is mnemonic devices designed just to trigger your memory in conversation, either about something you already know, or later on when you think back about this conversation, you have a funny image in your head and you think, oh yeah, that's part of civic engagement. So those are my goals for today. And I'm hoping that you will find all sorts of avenues to explore from this, and that you will discover that civic engagement is bigger than the biggest bread box ever. Now, let's talk about the big bread box, because obviously I have some kind of obsession with bread and maybe with carbs or something like that. So the idea of a bread box has been around for about, I don't know, 60, 70 years now. And people might remember, or they might know of, if you're a trivia person, a television program called What's My Line that was on television from 1953 to 1967. And one of the panelists on this show was the comedian Steve Allen. Now, for those of you who don't know the show, what this show was kind of a televised version of 20 questions. When television was brand new and nobody really knew what kind of programs would appear on television and what would be interesting for people. It was a televised version of 20 questions in which panelists who were celebrities tried to guess what some mystery guest did for a living. Did they make something? Did they do something? What was their line, as it were? And it's sort of a 1950s Madison Avenue phrase. What's your line? What do you do? Well, Steve Allen became famous for this tagline, which he asked every single guest, no matter what they were talking about. So even if someone was a musician or somebody was a playwright, and whatever it was they did, when it came to Steve Allen's turn to ask a question, he didn't ask, do you do things in your house or do you do things out in public? He always asked people, well, is what you do bigger than a bread box? And whether it made sense or not, he asked the question all the time. Is it bigger than a bread box, what you do? And he eventually left the show. He returned regularly, but he went on to his next gig, which is that he was one of the co-founders of The Tonight Show. And some people may know him from that as well. But the line, is it bigger than a bread box, kind of entered the cultural lingo of sort of second half of 20th century America.
Of the six or of the four candidates.
Sorry, I missed that.
We're okay, Elizabeth. There's just sometimes folks forget to mute and then they have something going on. We're good.
Okay. Am I still there?
You are there.
All right, cool. I got a funny Zoom message right there and then. So, all right, so much for Steve Allen. So the idea here is that civic engagement is everything that you do and is bigger than a bread box. It's the stuff we make all the time in our interactions with each other in our society. I'm still getting Zoom messages popping up at me. The easy way to deal with something that is really, really massive and universal like this is to start by kind of narrowing it down and telling you what it's not. And so what you may remember, if you go back to third or fourth or fifth grade, you may remember, yeah, I'm fighting the Zoom wars this morning, Heather. So this is sort of the slide that got missed over while the Zoom messages were coming. So we're going to talk about what civic engagement is. We're going to talk about why we do it. Also, I'm going to give you some sense of what it looks like and then how we get past the inertia. So we'll carry on with what civic engagement is not limited to. And the answer is, it's not limited to what you had in middle school. In middle school, you had civics class. And we often don't teach this anymore. People lament, although in some ways we do. Civics class was something that's part of civic engagement, but it's much, much more limited. You see the picture of the Capitol here because civics is really, it's so often associated with politics. And the best definition that we've got comes from the League of Women Voters, which has been around for 100 years and is one of the most successful civic engagement groups out there. And what the League of Women Voters tells us is that civics is the study of the rights and obligations of citizens. So it's very exclusively political. It's not really the sort of large social environment at all. And it's a good start, but it is so limited that by the time you get to the 70s and the 80s, we weren't so much teaching civics as we were teaching social studies. So social studies is a little bit broader than civics. It includes generally examinations of geography and demography. So what an area is like and who are the people in it, and then all sorts of cultural things that come along with it. What type of government they survey of different social settings. And it's a cool thing to do, but it's still very passive, more passive even than civics. Civics class was about active things that people did, how they performed in the political arena, even as citizens. Social studies was much more passive. It was a smorgasbord or a survey of all sorts of different cultural settings, but it didn't actually generate activity on people's part. And I'll tell you a very odd social studies story that illustrates how unusual the phenomenon of developing social studies was. I grew up on the east side of Milwaukee and was in elementary school in the 1960s and early 70s. And our social studies program, when I was in 4th grade, consisted of 3 topics for the course of the year. The first half of the year, we studied the history and culture of Wisconsin. And that makes sense. That was cool. We talked about what it meant to be a citizen in Wisconsin. But for the second half of the year, we studied the culture and history of Alaska and Hawaii. And that was our whole year that we did that. And we did it. It made sense back in the 60s because those were the 2 newest states in the Union. But imagine an entire year in which a bunch of kids in Wisconsin study the history of Alaska and Hawaii and nothing else. So it was a really passive experience because most of those kids really, Alaska and Hawaii might as well have been the moon or Mars or something for us. So, it didn't have a connection to us. It was a very passive experience. And because it was a passive experience, social studies had to develop even further. But each step that we developed took us farther away from the active version that civics had been. And so we moved on to the social sciences. And what the social sciences were the economics, the politics, the education, the ideas, philosophy, religion, the family structure, all the things that we call culture. And if you go on and study this at the university level, it falls under the category frequently of anthropology or sociology, the social sciences in general. But for most young people, it still was a very passive experience, and it did not move us towards civic engagement. And in fact, much of what has happened to us since the change in the millennium, since the year 2000, what has happened is that we have begun to live in atomized times. And this is one of those PowerPoint slides that I told you is kind of a mnemonic. What you see here is an atomizer. Now, people who grew up in the second half of the 20th century, we used to talk about our world being the atomic age. And that was, people understood that to mean it was very scientific, and we had atomic power, we had atomic weapons, but we had atomic everything. In fact, in the city of Brussels in Belgium, there's an entire theme park called the Atomium, and all of the rides and things are atomic molecules that people can go in and out of. And so we were really excited about things that were atomic. And in my case, as a child, I was very excited by these cool things that sat on the dresser in my grandmother's bedroom that were called atomizers. And there's one of them here in front of you on the slide. Atomizers do exactly what they sound like. They take the liquid that's contained in the jar, and you press on that little rubber bladder, and it spreads everything out, sprays it out into little atomic particles. Well, anyway, droplets. And We loved this thing when I was a child. We loved this. My brother and I, we'd sneak into my grandmother's bedroom and we just had a great time atomizing everything. The problem was it had my grandmother's perfume in it. And so she knew that we had been in there and done this because we were busted. We smelled like grandma's perfume. Well, it's a funny little metaphor, but consider the social forces that have acted on us since the last half of the 20th century. Things like social media, the internet, we love them. They're like the atomizer on my grandmother's dresser. They're so cool. They do this great thing. You interact with them and they spray everything out. And guess what? We end up atomized. These are things that have separated us and spread us out so that we're all happy little atoms in our world, doing things all by ourselves and getting farther and farther away from each other, like the droplets in the perfume jar, and we are separated from each other. And the net result of this is that instead of civic engagement, instead even of social studies, instead of civics, we are all off doing our own things. And the great metaphor, the great illustration of this is Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. We used to bowl together. We used to bowl in leagues. We used to play in softball leagues. We used to have card games, and there were even card leagues, cribbage and poker games and things like this that people did together all the time. But the result of our atomized society is that even though we have these really great tools like the atomizers, the end result of the atomizer is that we end up atomized. We end up separated and we end up bowling alone. And Robert Putnam addressed this. I'm going to tell you what he said about this. He said, we have lost civic engagement. And by civic engagement, what he's referring to are the ways in which citizens participate in the life of a community in order to improve conditions or help shape the community's future. Okay. And he goes on to say this includes informal social activities like visit with your friends, card games, bowling, and anything that you do that including your formal activities, so including voting, including volunteering, including working at the elections, which I did last night. Actually, I did it all day yesterday, and all of your political participation, which includes all the civics that we used to talk about. So what Putnam argues is that we have to find some way to get back to the idea of the rights and obligations of the citizens, but now it becomes the rights and obligations of all people in whatever community they are in, both formal and informal activities. And that's what we're talking about when we say this is a big bread box. Putnam and others argue that civic engagement is everything you do with other people that helps shape your community or enhance your own personal well-being within the community. But it's always about what you're doing with other people. And so his definition has taken the definition from civics and expanded it until it's incredibly, incredibly large. Now, the problem with that is when you start telling people, well, it's anything and everything, now it's hard to imagine it. If I just tell you, think of something. Well, you don't have any boundaries. You don't have any guidelines. You don't have anything to sort of send you in one direction or another and help you shape your activities. And that's why I still need the bread box, because I still need to contain civic engagement somewhere within a concept, a bread box of some sort. And yet it's got to be the biggest bread box possible, because if it's not, then we lose our understanding of the value of informal activity as well as losing our formal activities. And when we lose that, bad things happen. The bad things that happen, well, this worked out very well for me. 2 weeks ago, Wisconsin's Department of Health Services, the director, Paula Tran, commented on the report that was issued, which described the state of health and well-being for everyone in Wisconsin. And what Paula Tran said, the conclusions of this report is that increasingly folks are feeling isolated. And mental health well-being was one of the primary findings in this comprehensive health assessment for the state, that people have mental health needs and they are not being served well. The indication of that is that people are feeling isolated. And almost a week after the DHS study was released, or the report was released, and she made these comments, Jeffrey Hall, who is a professor at the University of Kansas, issued a paper that basically says one conversation a day is absolutely essential to your mental health and well-being, but more is better. If you can only do one a day, that's good. Now, but more is better. Now, let me just say a word or two about Jeffrey Hall, because this guy has the best job in academia in all of America. His formal title is within his sociology department and organizational development department, but he is most often described as America's leading expert on friendship. And that's a great title to have. Can you imagine being the leading expert on friendship? I suppose one could argue that there are lots of people like that, but he somehow managed to make a job out of it. So, and he argues that we're living in really, really tough times. We are atomized, we are separated. But if you can have one conversation per day with a friend, you can enhance your health and well-being. And it's absolutely essential to do this. And so whatever you can do to have those conversations is going to be the root or the kernel from which other things grow. So what you've got here is a couple of possibilities. You got a couple of people getting together over coffee up in the upper right-hand corner, and they're having their one conversation a day. And that's part of what Jeffrey Hall is talking about. And then you see the people in the middle slide, and maybe they know each other, but maybe they just met in the park. But again, he's got them, having a conversation with each other. Notice the two grumpy old men in the lower left-hand corner. They're having a conversation too. And it looks like they don't totally agree, but notice that they are having coffee together and they are still together. And even if they disagree, they're still having their conversation. And that's essential to what goes on here, because those conversations where people don't agree but still manage to have a conversation can be incredibly productive and incredibly important as well. So he says, even if you have those kind of conversations, even if you have a friend that you just love to argue with, that's still a quality conversation. And if you can have conversations with people you don't know that well, that's okay too. But the quality of conversation isn't really what matters. For him, it's that you have it as regularly as possible. And the study that he based these findings on is a 2-year study with over 900 participants. And they focused on people who were just catching up, people who were joking around, people who were listening, people who were showing care or concern for other people, people who were having meaningful talks. You have to have a talk kind of thing. And valuing others and their opinions, and offering sincere compliments. Insincere compliments are appreciated in some ways, but sincere ones are better, right? So as it turns out, what Hall says is it doesn't matter which of the quality conversations you have. The very act of intentionally reaching out and having those conversations is what actually improves your mental health and well-being. Now, that's the first step in combating atomization, is talking to people. And we know, and later on, I think we'll talk a little bit about what happens when you're very, very isolated, for instance, physically isolated, or in circumstances where you can't get at people. But the study essentially says quality face-to-face conversations. Zoom is okay. He doesn't disregard that. But if you can have a conversation with people one-on-one, that's better. Now,
and I think the Wi-Fi and the snowstorm really did a bugger for us there. And I'm hoping, Ruth, if you want to try to get Elizabeth back.
She's here.
all
She's
right,
here?
I'm still here,
There we
although
go.
did we lose everybody else?
Nope.
Nope, everyone is
We're good.
still here.
Everybody's still here. We just lost your slides.
All right, let's go back here. Let's skip these guys back. Sorry about that, everybody.
Oh, there you are.
All
You're
right.
right on target.
So here's the thing. Let's go back for a second. So I am part of the Community Development Institute at the University of Wisconsin and in the extension. And we really, we accept these findings. We think that this is accurate and that when people are able to have these sorts of conversations, it develops into what we consider to be thriving communities. Now, our definition of thriving communities, I've got it up here on the board. It's when communities demonstrate sustainability, resiliency, and high standards of quality of life and place. Now that sounds really formal and it sounds really challenging, but the heart of it, the base of it, is the conversations that people have, the type that have been described by Jeffrey Hall and that Paula Tran is telling us we need people to be having. So how does Extension think people should or can get to these thriving communities? What are the social motions that lead to a thriving community? And this is sort of the technical part. This is maybe one would say the wonkier part. We think the first thing that leads to thriving communities is when individuals make informed decisions about anything. It doesn't matter about what those things are, but informed decisions are made by people who they try and research things. They collect data. They identify how resources are passed around from one entity to another. I try to identify what are the structures that shape their world, whether it's your local government or it's the geography that you're in. So that sounds very, very academic. It sounds very esoteric, one might say. Here's a simple way to do it. Informed decisions are made by people who ask questions, by people who have conversations with their neighbors, with their local leaders, with people who pass through their community working on projects. So informed decisions are the result of having conversations with people for, at the basic level, the most basic level of all. And one of the most important things that happens when you are making informed decisions, particularly when you're gathering data, is that you ask the question, is everybody's voice being heard? In other words, do we have some equitable opportunity here? Are we hearing everybody in the community and what they think on a particular topic? Now, how can you possibly get there? Well, the answer is you have to have more conversations with people. You have to talk with people, even people that you might not normally talk with. You might, you want to say to people, well, I've lived in this community for 7 years and I still can't find a good Italian bakery. Do you think we should start one? Do you think we need one? And you ask every single person that you know whether this is a good idea. I had a friend many years ago who believed that if you needed something, you just needed to mention it to as many people as possible, and sooner or later somebody had what you wanted. And she demonstrated this because she was living in an apartment in Boston and she didn't like the color on the wall. She asked her landlord if she could paint, and he said, sure, you can paint, but you got to buy the paint. And she didn't have any money. So she started to tell every single person she met, I really like blue and I really want a blue apartment. And what do you think about blue? Do you think there are any good colors of blue for people's walls? Or do you think blue is a bad color for people's walls? And after about the 7th person, she ran into someone who said, I have some blue paint and it's pretty nice. Would you like to try it? And they gave it to her. And it's just a sort of a silly example. Some people have heard there's a trade up phenomenon on the internet that sometimes does this, where people say, I have a paper clip and if you'll give me a stapler for it, then they try and trade their stapler up. And the byproduct of that sort of conversation is that you start to talk to people that you would not normally talk to. And in doing so, you move to this second pillar of a thriving community, which is you start to hear from people whose opinions or positions or knowledge may be different from yours. And that's really, really important, because in the end, if you don't sort of find out what everyone thinks, if you don't try and create an environment or a situation where as many voices as possible are taken into account, there tends to be a kind of a pushback, a rollback, and that works against thriving communities. What do I mean by this? Consider anybody out there who is a fan of Greek drama, consider the Greek playwright Aeschylus and his play The Bacchae, where he says, if you repress things in any society, if you push down voices, sooner or later they explode, and they explode sort of irrationally, and sometimes it's not constructive. So for the most part, we want to include as many voices as possible, and we want to consider as many positions as possible. We think for the most part in American culture, we like to talk about fairness, and equitable opportunity means trying to be fair about considering all sorts of people's points of views and what their position is in society, as well as whether things work out well for them or not. One of the challenges of social change all the time, sociologists will tell you, social change is a double-edged sword. For some people, it's great, and for some people, it's terrible. Think about blacksmiths in Detroit in 1910. They are doing just a great business, and then some kid named Henry Ford comes along and basically puts them out of business. Now, everybody's happy to have cars, but not everybody is happy, if you're a blacksmith, to be put out of work. So if you don't start taking into account these things, you end up with a whole population of disgruntled blacksmiths out there somewhere. The point I'm trying to make is that part of your thriving community is trying to find all these different opinions and positions, and all of those conversations, when they are focused on a topic like that, that's civic engagement. That's part of civic engagement, which gets even bigger as you continue those conversations. The more of those conversations you have with people who are not necessarily in agreement with you, not necessarily like you, not necessarily in the same circumstances, but still living in the same community, the more of those conversations you have, we find the more civil they get. So think about those two grumpy old men. They're still having a conversation over cups of coffee, even though they're obviously arguing. One of them's kind of pointing at each other and poking. And so they are, even while disagreeing, engaging in civil discourse. And civil discourse is a byproduct of you having as many conversations as possible, as many days of the year as possible. As your civil discourse increases, we get to what Robert Putnam was talking about when he defined civic engagement for us. And that is, you build social capital. Social capital is, this is the result of talking nicely with people, considering points of view, other points of view. And what it means is we build trust and companionship, even across community divides. And that's social capital. Go back to what Robert Putnam was saying, and he said, anything you do, informal or formal, that builds social capital is civic engagement. It sounds too easy, doesn't it? All you got to do is talk, right? There's got to be a trick to this. There's always a hook or a trick to these sorts of things. But the fact is, social capital, this sort of end result, when you put these things together, informed decision making, right? Equitable opportunity, builds civil discourse, and all of it results in social capital. And these things put together create the thriving communities. And you see each one of these things has a little extra description. So if you're looking at this slide after we have this conversation, if you go back to this presentation at some point, you've got some more fleshing out of these things, and it helps you to kind of chase them down if you're interested in pursuing this with these things in mind. In a thriving community, you are constantly then building and expanding your civic engagement. And that's our goal, is to make our civic engagement bigger than the biggest bread box, right? So how do we do all this stuff? Well, this is my wonkiest slide. This is my most sort of scholarly and academic slide, and I won't do this to you very often, but let's sort of run through it. We think that when you have a thriving community, when you have civic engagement, what you've got is, here, let me get a nice highlighter. You have, we like that one, community members who build trust, mutual understanding, and shared knowledge with each other. But you also have community members who sooner or later say, we need an Italian bakery in this town. We don't have enough cannoli. We don't have a good place to have coffee in the afternoon. So we get together and we take joint action to shape change. And at some point, when we realize that some people may have been left out of the conversation previously, community members and organizational leaders address inequities at the organizational or the community level. We try and include everybody in here if we can, because if we don't, like the Bacchae, they explode later on in ways that are maybe less constructive. And the next one has a star next to it because it's my favorite. It's the one I love, and I constantly preach it in my own community of 10,000 people. Solutions and strategies that address community priorities. In the most successful situations, they're driven by community members who are most affected or impacted. So those of us who really desperately want coffee in the afternoon and to play cards and eat cannoli, we're pushing for more bakeries. And so that one, I've got that little gold star there because I love it. And community members and organizations, when they do this, whether you intend to or not, these activities demonstrate cultural responsiveness. And so these are all things that enhance communities and make them thrive. Communities that aren't thriving are communities that fight these things, that don't find their commonalities, that say, I don't really care about your Italian bakery. I don't care if you need caffeine in the afternoon. I only care about playing cards. And I think, well, you know what? I don't care about playing cards, but I do care about coffee. And I think we can have tables at the bakery where you can play cards. So I can find a conversation to have with the card players if they can find a conversation to have with me over cannoli. And that's the formal civic engagement stuff. Yeah, the question is always the practical. How do you make this stuff happen? It all sounds great and it all sounds so easy, but how do we actually make it happen? How do we overcome our atomization? How do we stop bowling alone? And how do we move from just conversations to actually doing things? Well, there's a process for that. And again, there are many processes for that. The one I'm going to outline for you today is a process that people I've worked with have been successful with. And we found that we can make some progress. You might find other ways to do this, and that's totally okay. As Jeffrey Hall says, however you find it, whether it's a meaningful conversation or joking, as long as you're out there being intentional about it. And that's maybe the first and most important thing, is that the process needs to be intentional, and which is why we're talking today, because we want you to be thinking about civic engagement. We want you to be saying, am I engaging in my community? And if not, what can I do about that? Who can I talk to about that? See, we circle around to the conversation again. And the other thing is, we find that it has to be achievable. It's got to be something you really can get done. If the goal that you have is not an Italian bakery, but what you'd like is maybe to well, we've got a good Italian heritage in this community. We'd like to change the official language of our city board to only Italian. Not really going to be an achievable thing. It's partly because it's not practical, right? It's not really going to serve anybody well. So you got to make sure that what you choose is achievable. And here's the sneaky one, the extra one. Things that are renewable, things that even if the effort seems to wane, just by thinking about it, going back to the intentionality, you can revive the effort and keep it going. Renewable efforts are really successful. That's part of that whole idea of resiliency that was in our thriving community, is that you can get knocked down, your civic engagement efforts can get knocked down, and you can pick them up and get going again as often as needed until you get your Italian bakery or whatever it is you want. Let's look at those things a little more specifically. The intentional part is just identifying a desire. planning and effort, and thinking of a goal, something that you want, or something that you think you need. The achievable thing is something that stretches you a little bit, but the key here is that you build in success. And I'll talk about how you do that in just a second. And the renewable thing, you'll recognize that because when anybody checks you, when anybody says, well, how are you doing with that? Or what's the phrase people like to use nowadays? How's that working for you? Which is kind of a smart alecky way of saying whatever you're doing is not working. When you build an intentional, achievable objective, even if it's just you and 3 friends, if you make it something that's renewable, every time some smart aleck says, how's that working for you? You can say, yeah, it's working really well. And you start it up again. So people's cynicism doesn't kill your initiative and your engagement, because it's very easy in our culture for people to be a little cynical that way. And that does tend to demoralize people. So let's talk about the intentional part. How do you decide what you want? Well, you, like my friend Lynn, looking for blue paint, you say to everybody you can possibly talk to, what this town needs, or what this city, what this condo association needs is, and then you fill in your own what you want for the community. You walk around and you say, what we need is an Italian bakery. And if 9 out of 10 people say to you, nah, I don't really like cannoli. No, I'm not thinking that. I'd like a German bakery. Okay, fine. I'm good with baked goods, right? But just by asking that question of all those people, you're fulfilling Jeffrey Hall's imperative to have these conversations, because you are inquiring of people's opinions. You're listening to them. You're respecting their opinions. People love to be asked their opinions, but they hate it when it's obvious that you don't listen to their opinion. So you got to go out there and you got to ask people, well, what do we need? And sometimes the answer is going to be, we don't need anything. We like it the way things are. And that's a valid answer as well. It might not be a sustainable answer, but it's definitely a valid answer. And it's important for you to know that about people, because if you go back to the STAR outcome that I had selected, that I said was my favorite one, that people most affected by change take action to make that change. If people don't want change and change is imposed on them, then they get angry and they get resentful and they sabotage it as well. So you do want to go out and start your conversations by asking people, what do we need? What would we like? What don't we want? And see, although the positive is much easier than the negative. And so that helps you be intentional about what you want to do. Maybe what people tell you when you go out and ask them is, what we need is a place where we can play cards once a month. And, we're going to reserve a room at the library once a month and play cards there. In the community that I live in, we have 5 women who do exactly that. Once a month, they get together in the library. They reserve a room so that they can be raucous. But the beautiful part about it is that they can play cards. None of them has to clean the living room to have company come over. None of them has to provide snacks or food or anything else. All they do is play cards together. And that is a perfectly acceptable desire in a community. So first thing to do is start finding out what people want and see if it matches what you want. Sometimes I go out and because I'm on the county board here, I go out and I ask people, would you like it if we had the city snowplow the sidewalks instead of people shoveling snow? And if people tell me, no, I really don't want that, then okay, I've learned that my idea maybe wasn't such a good one, and I move on from it. So part of being intentional is finding out what it is the community really wants and what maybe they're not interested in. And then you go look for something else. And then you make it something achievable. And by achievable, I've got a couple of examples for you here. You would think that I was a big coffee drinker from all the coffee illusions here, but I really drink tea, not coffee. Recently, somebody told me that they had challenged themselves as part of the tradition of New Year's resolutions to have 52 coffee dates this year. It didn't really matter with who. This person said, I'm going to have 52 coffee dates. And, one a week. unfortunately, it was already, I think, a month into the year, and she said she was four coffee dates behind and was looking for people to have coffee with. But it's a really great effort. Part of it is it forces her to get into that habit of conversation with people that builds all the rest of this stuff. Maybe you don't like coffee, and maybe you don't want to try and catch up on being 8 weeks behind on coffee dates. Challenge yourself to go to 4 town or county or municipal meetings of any sort. I've got those people down on the bottom of the screen, all sitting there having a really good time at a city council meeting, especially the guy in the front row who's sleeping. We don't usually see people at county board meetings who are sleeping, and they're much more exciting than that. Why would you go to these things? Well, because first of all, they're free. Right? There's no admission charge. It's not like you're being forced to go to the theater or something like that and spend a lot of money. They're free. They're open to the public. In our county, they're all televised. Well, they're all available on Zoom. But going in person is kind of a cool thing to do. And you can go and you can talk to the people in your community who allocate resources and decide what efforts are made in your community, and it just gets you out there. It just gets you out doing something. If you don't like that, if you think politics, schmolitics, well, okay, maybe you like theater, or maybe you like sports. Even if you don't have kids in the school system, it's a lot less expensive and less difficult to go to a high school basketball game than to go to a Milwaukee Bucks game, right? The parking is always cheaper. I can't imagine that it's not free at every high school in the whole state of Wisconsin. So, there's a poster there from the Battle of the Wits, which was put on by Wisconsin Rapids High School a couple of years ago. And yeah, there was an admission charge because theater has its costs, but it still was really cheap, $7 versus $75 to go see a Broadway play if you happen to be lucky enough to be in New York and get a Broadway ticket. So the idea here is just that you set a goal for yourself personally to achieve something that you can achieve. And you say to yourself, but this is meaningless. This doesn't get me anywhere. This is just goofing off, right? Right, absolutely. What it is you are practicing the process of civic engagement. And what you practice is what you will do in your everyday situations, even when under stress. So you want to just practice 52 conversations a year. You want to practice engaging with your local officials. You want to practice going out to entertainment within your community. You want to practice asking people, what does this community need? Because it's the process that's going to get you there. And by the way, the process is called civic engagement, right? So the renewable one is kind of an odd one. Go back to New Year's Day traditions. About 40 years ago when I was a kid, I marveled at people who constantly broke their New Year's resolutions. In fact, it seemed like it's a greater tradition to break your New Year's resolution than it is to actually achieve it. And I thought, well, this is just stupid. Why don't people just make New Year's resolutions that they can actually manage to achieve? Why not do it that way? And I racked my brain, and I was probably about 13 or 14 at the time. And I thought, what could I really achieve that would, not be bad, but not be dumb either? And my answer was, okay, I resolved to drink more water this year. Well, that was an easy one, right? Because I did need to do something intentional. I needed to actually drink the water. But the best part was every single time somebody said to me, well, have you kept your New Year's resolution? I took a sip of water, and guess what? I looked at them and said, yeah, I'm still holding to mine. Boy, in November, I was still saying, yes, I'm hanging in with my New Year's resolution. It wasn't something that depended on other people. It depended only on me. And I could never stop. I could never be sort of caught not doing it, because the minute someone brought it to my attention, I could start it up again. And so what you want is to have efforts that whenever you're checked by somebody saying, how's that working for you? You can say, it's working great, and you carry on. Because one of the most important things about civic engagement is just doing it, just having the conversation, forming the intention, talking to the other people, and just engaging in it is the benefit in itself. Now, I'll give you a really, really old historic reference for people who are fans of esoteric literature from the 1960s. Back in the 1960s, a Canadian author named Marshall McLuhan wrote a book called The Gutenberg Galaxy, in which he coined the phrase, "The medium is the message." And I'm going to steal his phrase and tell you, in this case, the process is the message. The process of engaging with other people in your community is the achievement in and of itself. So this is a regenerative process. It feeds itself, and the more you do it, the more it becomes what you do, and kind of your life starts to kind of circle around this sort of engagement. And so it feeds your community while it feeds the people of the community, the individuals. In other words, this process of civic engagement de-atomizes people. If we could go back into my grandmother's bedroom and take that perfume and suck it back into that perfume bottle so that she didn't know we were in there playing with things on her dresser, that's what civic engagement does for you. And it doesn't matter if you're playing cards at the library or arguing with some grumpy old man over coffee. Now, what if you're not really in a position to do this? What if you are really, truly isolated? There are people who are homebound. There are people for whom Zoom is your best option right now. There are people who have given up their driver's license or given up their car. My mother constantly has this conversation with me. She talks to me, she's in her 90s, and she talks to me at least once every other day when she's not talking to my sister on the other days, and my brother on the other days. And so she's at least doing the conversation, the one daily conversation. And we do it on these Zoom things. I must tell you that the frustrating thing was trying to teach her how to hang up on Zoom, on video calls, because she couldn't find on the screen where the hang up button was. And I taught her that if she tapped on my nose, it would pop up the end meeting button. And my mother very, very sweetly said to me, "But I don't want to hit you on the nose." She learned to do it, right? So what do you do if you are the person who is isolated? Well, if you have the option, Zoom is lovely, virtual is lovely. Maybe you can't even get there very regularly. So what do? Look at the opera singer at the bottom of the screen, right? Even the planning process matters. Even the planning process actually has physical and mental health advantages for you. What's the opera singer doing down there? Well, when I was in college, I went to a very, very good school here in Wisconsin that had a really good conservatory. I don't sing, and you'll all be happy for that. And I was not a student in the conservatory, but lots of my friends were. And you know, college kids being what college kids are, they got laryngitis, they got mono, they get strep throat, all of these sorts of things. And when they did, the vocal instructors were very, very strict about this. Don't come to class and don't listen to any music, because the very act of listening to music, studies show, constricts the vocal cords for people who have singing training or like to sing a lot, because they sing along in their mind, and their mind does not separate between the actual singing and just imagining singing. So they actually stressed their throats out just by listening to music. So if you had a sore throat, the last thing in the world you wanted to do as an opera singer was listen to music. The vocal instructors said, stay home, turn the stereo off, because even thinking about it matters. And this also shows in the planning process for civic engagement. Sitting down this afternoon with a cup of coffee and imagining, what would I say to somebody if somebody were here sitting across the table from me, is the beginning of the conversation that you would have if there was somebody there. And you want to start practicing that conversation so that if the opportunity does pop up, for instance, on Zoom, you can have that coffee cup conversation, even if it's only virtual. So you want to start the intention right away. And everybody that you meet, you want to ask for blue paint, basically. Anybody who comes in, you want to say, what do you think this community needs? suppose you only have a person who stops in, like your postal carrier, to deliver the mail, and you stop that postal carrier for a second and say, what do you think this town needs? Do you think there's a way we could clear the sidewalks better so that postal carriers could get through? So start planning those conversations so that when the opportunity pops up, you do have it right away. And if you still don't have anybody stopping by, now the intent, there's still an intentional kind of effort you can make, which is that you begin calling people like your ADRC or your library. And what you ask the library is, do you have an outreach service? Do you have delivery for homebound patrons? Do you have any sort of social gathering group for people who want to play cards? And if they don't, then you call the library director, you call your city council, and you call your county board members, and you start saying, you know, what this community needs is a library outreach service, because that's your taxpayer dollars at work. And you begin the intentional, achievable, renewable effort of trying to get somebody in your community to come to you in order to overcome that isolation. The effort is, it's the civic engagement itself. And guess what? You're the person, if you're in that situation, you're the person who is most affected by that change. So you are the person who has the best motivation and the best opinion about how to get that done. So all of these things are, they're things that we used to take for granted. We used to do them without even noticing we were doing them in many small communities. But now that we are kind of atomized, it does require a greater intentionality. And in order to get that intentionality, I would argue what you have to do is step back, look at the world around you, imagine the biggest bread box that you possibly can, and say, in my bread box is all this activity that I'm planning and then communicating to people if I can, and trying to make change for myself. So that the next time somebody says, what do you do? Even if you're my 94-year-old mother, what do you do? She says, I do civic engagement. And the person says, well, wait a minute, what's that? What do you actually do? What's your line? And she laughs and she says, what do? I make community, and that's bigger than the biggest bread box ever. So happy engaging, whether you're playing cards or getting murals painted on giant buildings in your community. My wishes for you are that you get started thinking about it, you get started asking everybody for blue paint or Italian bakeries, and you imagine yourself as participating in the biggest bread box ever, making your community. Well, that's a lot of goofy ideas that I throw out there. And I told you the anthropologist side of me means that I sometimes circle around in odd ways. I'm perfectly happy to respond to any comments or questions that people have. Although I will also warn you that one of the humbling things about civic engagement all the time is that the more I learn, the less I know. And the more I say to people, the more I realize that there's more to be said, because other people have all sorts of other things to say too. So this is not gospel by any means. This is where we're at right now, working in community building. When I say we, I mean some of us in community development, but there are many, many ways. I used to tell students when I taught in Boston, there was one road to Revere Beach as far as most people were concerned. But if you were in the know, there were 3 other ways to get there. So I used to joke and tell people there's more than one way to get to Revere Beach. There's more than one way to get to civic engagement. This is just one path for you to follow, one process. It's one that we've seen has a fair amount of success, but it doesn't mean it's the only way. So I'm always open to more learning. And I'm really happy that all of you were here this morning. And I apologize if Zoom threw me off or did any weird things, or if it looked like thumb wrestling with myself. So, all right. Happy Italian bakery efforts for everybody.
Elizabeth, thank
go
you
ahead.
so much. I know I'm actually going to look for a blue cannoli now for some weird reason. And for the rest of you, what this is really nice, Jackie Caratini gave the presentation a few weeks ago. Do you know how valuable you are? And one of her large nuggets was have a conversation with a friend, have that connection, say hi to that person in the grocery store. So you can see how some of this is very individual and some of this gets out into our community. We did pop the link to our evaluation in the chat box. If you would be so kind to click that link, it'll open a new page and have a couple short questions for you so you can let us know what you think and if you have any other ideas for what you would like to see on our Wise Wisconsin Wednesdays, we would appreciate that. And if anyone has any questions, you can certainly pop it in the chat. We can stay on for a few minutes or you can unmute and we will see you next week. Thank you so much.